Have you ever wondered if the thoughts that suddenly cross your mind, those gut feelings, quiet whispers, or unexpected urges, could actually be God's way of speaking to you? Because what if the protection you've been praying for isn't delayed? It's already happening right now inside your own thoughts. Too many people wait for a voice from heaven, a supernatural sign in the sky, or a miraculous dream to confirm God is near. But the truth is far more intimate, far more powerful. God's voice often speaks not to your ears, but through your mind, subtle, quiet, yet undeniable. Every time you felt a strange hesitation before making a decision, every time a certain path just didn't feel right, every time a voice inside said, "Don't go there, wait or leave now," those weren't random, those weren't coincidences. Those were divine interventions, hidden in what most call intuition, but heaven calls direction. In a world overloaded with noise, distractions, and voices pulling us in every direction, the most important one is often ignored. The still, small voice of God that protects you not through thunder, but through clarity. His guidance doesn't always feel spiritual. It can come as a strong thought, a sudden discomfort, a memory, or a phrase that just won't leave your mind. And here's the part no one tells you. Spiritual protection doesn't always look like an angel with a sword. It often looks like God blocking a job, ending a relationship, or making you uncomfortable in a situation that isn't meant for you. That moment when you thought something doesn't feel right, and you left. That moment when you were about to trust someone, but a quiet resistance held you back. That thought that came out of nowhere and changed your decision, that was God's mercy. And yet how many times have we ignored it? How many times have we said, "It's just my imagination," only to realize later we were being spared from harm? How many times have we begged God for a sign while he was already shouting in silence through closed doors, delayed plans, and unrest in our spirit? Yes, God still speaks today. Yes, he still warns, guides, redirects, and protects. But the way he does it is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's internal. Sometimes it's in the moments you feel alone, confused, or restless. That's where his voice hides, deep within the thoughts you often doubt. Because the battlefield isn't always outside, it's in the mind. And if the enemy knows that, so does God. This is why it's so important to recognize how he speaks, not just through sermons or scriptures or worship music, but through those sudden urges to pray, the feeling that something is off, the voice that says stop, when everything around you says go. Right now, you might be in a place of confusion, facing choices, people, or situations that seem harmless, but feel heavy. You might be wondering if you're being too cautious, too emotional, too sensitive. But what if you're not? What if that internal tension is spiritual? What if that hesitation is divine? And what if, by learning to recognize how God speaks directly to your mind, you could avoid pain, heartache, danger, and instead walk in peace, clarity, and divine protection? Because what you're about to hear may not only change the way you see your thoughts, it might just open your eyes to the way God has been protecting you all along. If any part of what you just heard made your heart pause even for a second, then you already know this message was meant for you. And if you've ever felt that strange inner pull, that warning before the storm, or that deep sense of this isn't the right path, I want to hear your story. Tell me in the comments, has God ever spoken to your mind in a way that protected you? Maybe it didn't make sense at the time, but now you see it clearly. Your testimony might be the confirmation someone else is desperately waiting for. And if you're still learning to recognize that voice, that whisper of protection in your mind, don't worry, you're not alone. This space is for you, a space of light, truth, and divine insight. So if this message is speaking to something deep inside you, give this video a like. It helps us spread this word to more people who are searching for answers just like you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There's so much more revelation ahead, and you don't want to miss the next message God is preparing for your heart. Now stay with me, because what you're about to discover may reveal why some delays in your life were never setbacks, but shields. There's something unsettling about silence, especially when you're seeking answers. We've been conditioned to expect God's voice to arrive with thunder, revelation, or something dramatic that shakes the earth beneath us. But what if his most powerful words come in the quietest moments? What if the reason we miss him is because we're only listening with our ears when he's speaking through our thoughts? Think about it. How many times have you sat in prayer, desperate for a sign, hoping for some clear direction, and all you got in return was silence? A silence that almost felt like abandonment. But then, days later, maybe even hours, you suddenly felt clarity. You made a decision that brought you peace. You avoided something that in hindsight could have wrecked your life. And when you look back, you realize that God never left. He never stopped speaking. He just didn't speak the way you expected. You see, God doesn't always shout. He doesn't always part the sea or send fire from heaven. Sometimes he whispers, and not even with sound, but with thought, a sudden knowing, a quiet conviction, an idea that didn't feel like yours, a warning that came out of nowhere, that right there was his voice. That gentle redirection was his way of guiding you. But the reason we don't recognize it is because we keep waiting for something that feels spiritual. We think God can only speak through pastors, prophets, or scripture. And yes, he absolutely does. But he's also speaking in your daily life, through your conscience, through your discernment, through the strange way your spirit becomes restless when you're walking into danger. There is a deep mystery in how God communicates. It's not always logical. It's not always comfortable, but it's always intentional. You were never meant to hear him only with your ears. You were meant to feel him in your spirit. That's why his messages often bypass the noise and settle directly into your thoughts. And if you're sensitive enough to feel that shift inside you, you'll begin to notice a pattern. Every time you followed that still, small prompting, you were protected. Every time you ignored it, you found yourself in regret. Let me tell you something the enemy doesn't want you to understand. If God's voice had to depend on volume to get your attention, the enemy would always try to outshout him. But when God speaks inside your mind, he bypasses the noise completely. He drops truth into your heart like seeds, and they grow without sound. This is divine strategy. It's not flashy, but it's eternal. And maybe that's why you've been feeling what you've been feeling lately. Maybe the confusion in your life isn't just about decisions, it's about discernment. Maybe God is already speaking and your spirit is catching it, but your mind is still waiting for thunder. That inner tension, that second guessing, that unusual sense of awareness, that might not be anxiety, that might be instruction. The mind is a battlefield. You've heard this before, but maybe you didn't realize that God chooses to enter that battlefield to reach you. He doesn't avoid the noise. He invades it, and he does so gently with divine precision. When you are about to step into something dangerous, when you are about to trust someone who isn't who they seem, when you are on the verge of making a decision that will wound your soul, he speaks, sometimes through a pause, sometimes through a thought that stops you mid-action, sometimes through a word you suddenly remember from a sermon or a verse you once read years ago. And the most powerful part, he does this without forcing you. He never screams over your free will. He simply places the thought there, the warning, the escape, the peace, and he waits to see if you'll recognize him in it. You are not crazy for feeling what you feel. You are not imagining the patterns you've been noticing. God is teaching you to hear him differently, to recognize his voice, not just in church, not just in songs, but in traffic, in silence, in dreams, in decisions, in the everyday rhythm of your thoughts. Some of you right now are realizing that moments you once dismissed as coincidence were actually divine conversations. That time you changed your mind at the last second, that sudden feeling that kept you home, that delay that frustrated you but saved your life, those weren't random. That was him. If any of this resonates with you, I want to invite you into something deeper, not just to hear about God, but to hear from him. Because he's not far away. He's already inside the very place where your thoughts are being formed. So now, let's talk. Has this ever happened to you? Have you ever felt a thought that didn't feel like your own? A warning that made no sense in the moment, but ended up saving you? I want you to share it. In the comments, write the phrase, "God spoke to my mind." Or if you feel bold, tell your story. Every comment is not just engagement, it's testimony, and testimonies build faith. You've probably heard the phrase, "It's all in your head." The world uses it to dismiss emotions, to rationalize fear, to reduce spiritual experiences to chemical reactions and stress. But what if I told you that some of the deepest spiritual battles you've ever faced didn't happen in your circumstances? They happened in your mind. What if your overthinking, your sleepless nights, your sudden doubts and unexplained confusion weren't just mental health issues or everyday stress, but actual warfare, invisible, quiet, but fierce? And what if the enemy knew that if he could confuse your thoughts, he could confuse your direction? This isn't just about feeling lost or anxious. It's about the spiritual dimension behind those feelings. Because the truth is, the mind is one of God's most sacred places of communication, and also one of the enemy's favorite targets. And here's the tension. Both God and the enemy are speaking to you, but neither uses a loudspeaker. They both plant thoughts. They both whisper suggestions. They both wait to see which voice you will give authority to. Think about the last time you were about to make a decision that seemed right, but something felt wrong. Logically, it made sense. Everyone around you said, "Go for it." But inside, your thoughts were noisy, unsettled, tense. That wasn't just overthinking. That was a clash between divine direction and demonic distraction. That was spiritual warfare in real time, happening not around you, but within you. And if you don't learn to identify this pattern, you'll start to second-guess every prompting, every moment of conviction, every nudge from God. We often expect the enemy to come with horns and fire, but he's more subtle than that. He knows how to sound like your voice. He knows how to make fear feel like logic. He knows how to camouflage his influence as common sense. And if you don't recognize when he's trying to occupy space in your thoughts, you'll mistake bondage for clarity. That's why the word says to take every thought captive. It's not poetic, it's survival. Because not every thought you think is yours. Some were planted, some were inserted to stop your purpose before you even took your first step. Now, I'm not saying every moment of doubt is demonic. We are human. We feel, we struggle. But there's a very real difference between human uncertainty and spiritual confusion. One draws you inward, asking questions that lead to peace. The other spirals, exhausts, and disconnects you from God's voice. The enemy thrives in that space of disconnection, where you start believing lies dressed as your own thoughts. Lies like, "You're not good enough, you'll always be stuck, God isn't with you, you missed your chance." Lies that sound familiar because they've echoed in your head for years. But just because a thought feels familiar doesn't make it true. Sometimes it's just been there so long, it's learned how to speak your language. And here's the breakthrough. The more you recognize that your mind is a battlefield, the more you'll understand that every moment of mental chaos is a call to spiritual clarity. You weren't meant to fight these battles alone. You weren't designed to sit silently while thoughts of fear, shame, or torment take over. God gave you discernment, not just to sense spirits in others, but to recognize which thoughts are from Him and which are not. And when you start identifying the enemy's strategy, everything changes. You stop spiraling. You stop overanalyzing. You start silencing voices that don't align with God's promises. You might be wondering, how do I know when a thought is from God? The answer isn't always instant. It's a process. But one thing is certain, God's thoughts bring peace even when they bring conviction. God's thoughts restore, not accuse. They don't push you into panic. They lead you into truth. Even when He's correcting you, it feels like love, like warmth, like freedom knocking at the door of your mind. On the other hand, the enemy's thoughts might seem urgent, but they're filled with fear. They might sound rational, but they're rooted in shame. They might look like strategy, but they're laced with anxiety. Learn to discern not just what the thought says, but what it produces in you. Some of you are carrying weights in your mind that were never meant to be yours. You've been in relationships that clouded your thinking, environments that drowned out God's voice, addictions that dulled your discernment, and still God speaks. Still, He gently reminds you, that thought isn't from me. Still, He waits for you to pause, breathe, and ask, Lord, what are you saying in the middle of this mental storm? And maybe that's the invitation you've been ignoring, not to escape your thoughts, but to bring them to the one who sees the root, to stop labeling your confusion as overthinking and start calling it what it is, warfare. And not to be afraid of that battle, but to fight it with the truth of who God says you are. You are not your darkest thoughts. You are not the voice that says you're broken beyond repair. You are not the lie that says you've failed too many times. You are God's. And He doesn't just live in your heart, He wants to reign in your mind. If you're still with me, I want you to comment right now, I take back my mind. Or if this message hit a nerve, tell me what you've been wrestling with. Your words might open someone else's eyes to realize they're not alone in this battle. And remember, every comment here turns a moment of warfare into a moment of worship. Have you ever felt that strange, unsettling feeling in your chest right before making a decision that seemed completely logical? Maybe everyone around you was saying, go for it. Maybe the opportunity looked perfect on paper. Maybe even your emotions were excited. But still, something inside you just wouldn't settle. That feeling, that deep, quiet discomfort that you couldn't explain, might not have been fear. It might have been divine protection. Because when God speaks, it's not always with words. Sometimes He speaks through resistance, through hesitation, through a gentle no that doesn't come from your intellect but from your spirit. And yet, we're trained to ignore it. Society says, follow your heart. But what if your heart is still healing from old wounds and can't see clearly? Culture says, trust the facts, but facts don't always account for spiritual danger. People say, don't overthink, but what they call overthinking might actually be divine discernment kicking in. Because here's the truth. Sometimes God doesn't block you with visible barriers. He simply makes you uncomfortable enough that you choose to stop. And if you've ever walked away from something that didn't make sense to leave, but later realized it saved you pain, then you already know what I'm talking about. There's a language God uses that doesn't translate into speech. It moves through the body like a signal, a gut feeling, a tightness in the chest, an unexplainable weight. Sometimes it even feels like fear, but it isn't. It's wisdom. And the problem is, we often confuse the two. We tell ourselves, I'm just afraid, when really we're being warned. We push through the unease because we don't want to be irrational or dramatic, only to find out later that the relationship, the deal, the open door wasn't from God. It was a setup. That's why you have to stop ignoring that sacred signal. God isn't just interested in giving you revelation through scripture and sermons. He's interested in protecting you in the everyday, in the mundane, in the decisions that look small but lead to big consequences. He sees what you can't. He knows what's hiding behind the opportunity. And when He senses danger ahead, He doesn't always stop the car. He puts up signs in your soul that say, slow down, turn around. This isn't for you. But the world moves fast. Social media teaches you to respond quickly. Hustle culture tells you to say yes now and think later. And if you're not careful, you'll move faster than your peace and then wonder why everything feels out of place. You'll end up in rooms you were never meant to be in, saying yes to things that were never in your destiny, tied to people that dilute your purpose. All because you ignored that early signal, the discomfort, the tension, the unexplainable check in your spirit. You know what's wild? Some of the most dangerous moments in your life weren't dramatic. They were subtle. The wrong phone call you almost answered, the job you nearly accepted, the invitation you considered, but something told you not to go. That's how God works. Not always with storms and lightning, but with silence that feels heavy, thoughts that won't sit right, and a sense that something just isn't aligned. And here's what makes it even more mysterious: that protection doesn't always come with confirmation right away. Sometimes you obey the nudge and walk away, and nothing bad ever happens. And because nothing bad happened, you wonder, was that really God? But don't you see? That's the proof it was. The danger didn't happen because you obeyed. You were protected from what you never had to see. That's the kind of God we serve, a God who warns before the fall, who redirects before the heartbreak, who stirs your spirit when your eyes can't yet see the truth. But you must listen. You must become familiar with the way he speaks through discomfort. You must stop labeling every unease as doubt and start asking, Lord, is this you protecting me? Because divine protection doesn't always come in the form of miracles. Sometimes it comes in the form of discomfort, in relationships that suddenly shift, in conversations that don't flow like they used to, in environments that used to excite you but now drain you. These aren't coincidences. They're clues. They're spiritual notifications saying, there's something here I don't want you to touch. And if you ignore these clues long enough, your spirit becomes desensitized. You begin to normalize what should have been avoided. You begin to adapt to atmospheres God never intended for you. That's when clarity fades. That's when peace feels distant. And that's when the enemy moves in, not with force, but with subtle manipulation. But God, in his mercy, keeps speaking. He keeps warning. He keeps pulling your heart away from the fire. And the more you train yourself to respond to that tension, to honor the discomfort instead of pushing it away, the safer your path becomes. Not because life will be easy, but because you'll be walking under divine guidance, not just human logic. So if you've ever had that moment where something just felt off, even when everything looked right, I want you to tell me. Drop a comment right now and write the words, God protected me through discomfort, or share the story. When did you obey that feeling and realize later it was God? Your words could be the signal someone else has been waiting for. Your comment might be the divine protection someone else needs. You had it all mapped out. You prayed, you planned, you prepared. Everything seemed to be falling into place. And then suddenly, without warning, it all unraveled. The opportunity vanished. The door slammed shut. The person you trusted disappeared. And all you were left with was confusion, disappointment, and that familiar question that haunts so many hearts. Why would God let this happen if I was doing everything right? That's where the tension lives, in the space between your expectation and God's interruption. And that's where many miss his voice, because it doesn't come wrapped in answers. It comes wrapped in redirection. When plans fall apart, our first reaction is usually to assume we did something wrong. We panic. We doubt. We feel like God has forgotten us, or worse, that we've somehow failed him. But what if the collapse wasn't punishment? It was protection. What if the rejection was actually a rescue? What if the thing you thought was falling apart was actually being taken apart by God because it was never meant to carry the weight of your destiny? Sometimes the collapse of a plan is the beginning of a divine pivot, but it doesn't feel holy in the moment. It feels like failure. It feels like betrayal. It feels like silence from heaven. And if you're not careful, you'll start questioning your own worth, your identity, your ability to hear from God. But what you need to understand is this: the collapse is not the end. It's the evidence that God is rearranging something behind the scenes. He's not punishing you. He's positioning you. This is hard to accept in a world obsessed with control. We're taught to chase stability, to stick to the 5-year plan, to map out every detail. And when anything disrupts that narrative, we call it chaos. But God doesn't operate according to human strategy. He doesn't follow our timelines or fit into our systems. He's after something greater, your alignment with his will. And when your will starts drifting from his, even slightly, he will allow what you've built to break, not because he doesn't love you, but because he loves you too much to let you succeed in something that would destroy your peace later. You might be standing in the middle of something right now that looks like ruins, You thought this was the season where everything would make sense, but instead you're surrounded by confusion, and the enemy will try to tell you that God has abandoned you in the wreckage. But listen to me, what looks like a delay is often a detour. What feels like an end is often a divine exit. And if you're willing to surrender your disappointment, you might just find that the wreckage you're standing in is the ground where something better is about to be built. This isn't just spiritual theory. This is reality. The job that didn't work out might have kept you from a toxic culture. The person who walked away might have saved you from heartbreak that would have taken years to heal. The opportunity that slipped through your fingers might have distracted you from your calling. But in the moment, it's almost impossible to see. That's why God sometimes hides his redirection in what feels like rejection, because if he showed you the full picture too soon, you'd either fight to keep what was killing you or rush into something you're not ready for. And maybe that's where you are right now. Maybe everything you were counting on has collapsed, and the silence has made you wonder if God's still guiding you. But what if the silence is the space between the breakdown and the breakthrough? What if God is removing what you thought you needed so he can give you what your soul actually needs? It's hard to let go of control. It's hard to release what you were building when you gave it your whole heart. But surrender doesn't mean giving up. It means giving God room. It means trusting that if he allowed the plan to fall, then he has a better one. And no, that doesn't mean it won't hurt. It might, deeply. But it also means you're not stuck. You're being shifted, and in the shift, God speaks, not always with words, but through circumstances, through closed doors, through divine pauses, through detours you didn't choose. And if you can learn to hear him in those moments, if you can train your heart to trust that even chaos can carry his voice, then you'll stop resisting every collapse. You'll start asking, Lord, what are you building in this, instead of, why did you break it? So if you're in a season where everything seems to be falling apart and nothing is making sense, I want to know, can you feel that gentle nudge deep in your spirit that maybe, just maybe, this isn't destruction, that maybe God is rerouting you to protect what you can't yet see? If you've ever had a moment where your plans fell apart but later turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to you, I want you to share it below. Write the phrase, "The collapse saved me," or tell your story. Someone else may need your words to recognize their redirection. You've probably had this happen to you. A thought comes into your mind, random, persistent, maybe even a little inconvenient. At first you ignore it. It seems out of place, unrelated to what you're doing. But it doesn't leave. Hours later, it's still there. Days pass, and the same thought keeps coming back, like a loop you didn't ask for, like a whisper that won't go quiet. And at some point, you wonder, why can't I stop thinking about this? That's where the mystery begins, because not every recurring thought is a distraction. Some are deposits, divine interruptions planted by God to get your attention when everything else around you is too loud. In a culture obsessed with productivity and constant motion, it's easy to dismiss these moments. We assume we're overthinking. We assume it's stress, anxiety, or just mental clutter. But what if it's not that? What if it's heaven trying to break through the noise? And the only way God can reach you in the middle of the chaos is by putting the same phrase, the same image, the same name, or the same scripture on repeat in your mind. Not because you're obsessing, but because you're being invited to pause, to notice, to listen. This is where it gets deeper. God rarely forces himself into your life. He doesn't scream over your distractions. He whispers into your stillness. And when he finds that your mind is too overwhelmed to catch it once, he brings the message back again and again, until you realize this isn't just a passing thought. It's a prompting, it's direction, it's a spiritual signal. And if you stop long enough to ask, God, is this from you? You might just find that the repetition has a reason. Let's be honest. Most people don't know how to discern the difference between a God thought and a random thought. That's why they ignore the signs. That's why they miss the message. But one of the most overlooked ways God speaks is through persistence. Think about it. In Scripture, God called people multiple times before they responded. He called Samuel 3 times before the boy realized it was the Lord. Jesus often repeated himself when he was about to reveal something significant. The repetition wasn't an accident. It was a strategy, because God knows that in a world full of distractions, the only way to make something stick is to repeat it until your heart responds. You might be experiencing this right now. There's something that keeps showing up in your thoughts. Maybe it's a specific person. Maybe it's a decision you keep avoiding. Maybe it's a calling you've tried to suppress. Maybe it's a verse that randomly comes to mind when you're least expecting it. And no matter how many times you push it away, it returns. That's not obsession, that's divine persistence. And the longer you delay listening, the heavier the thought becomes, not to torment you, but to protect you. Because delayed obedience often leads to unnecessary pain. What's even more powerful is that sometimes the repeated thought isn't about something you want. Sometimes it's something you're afraid of, something that convicts you, something that challenges your comfort zone. And instead of embracing it, you fight it. You label it as stress, you run from it, you distract yourself. But even after your favorite Netflix series, even after you scroll through Instagram, even after the phone calls and the emails and the noise, the thought is still there, quiet, patient, waiting. And that's how you know it's from God. It doesn't beg for your attention, but it never leaves. The human brain filters thousands of thoughts a day. But there are some thoughts that don't just come from memory or emotion. They come from the spirit. They carry weight. They stir your soul. They feel like instructions, even when you don't fully understand them. And when those thoughts repeat themselves, it's not because your mind is malfunctioning. It's because your spirit is being led. Some of you have been asking God to speak and you think He hasn't. But the truth is, He already has. He just didn't speak the way you expected. You were waiting for a voice, and He gave you a pattern. You wanted a sign, and He gave you a sentence that keeps circling your thoughts. You were asking for confirmation, and He's been answering through repetition, over and over again. Now let me ask you something personal. What's the one thought that keeps coming back to you, no matter how much time passes? What's the one thing your heart won't let go of, even when your mind tells you it's too late, too risky, too uncomfortable? Maybe that's the very thing God is calling you to confront, to heal, to pursue, or to release. Maybe that thought is the door to your next season. So don't rush past it. Don't explain it away. Don't drown it with distractions. Sit with it. Pray about it. Test it. But most of all, listen. Because that thought might not be yours. It might be a message from heaven, sent over and over again, waiting for the moment you finally decide to pay attention. And if this is hitting you right now, if you're thinking of that one thing as I speak, I want you to comment the phrase, "God is repeating this for a reason." Or tell me what thought won't leave you alone lately. Don't worry about being perfect. This space is for real stories, real questions, real spiritual moments. Your comment could be the echo someone else needed to hear. You've been there. The storm is raging around you. Life is spinning out of control. The decisions feel too heavy. The uncertainty is suffocating. People are panicking, doors are closing, and everything seems to be pressing in at once. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, you feel it. A stillness, a quiet confidence, a peace that doesn't make sense. Not because the chaos disappeared, but because it stopped affecting you. That's not denial. That's not numbness. That is the voice of God, disguised as calm in the middle of crisis. We're taught that peace is the result of order, that you feel peace when everything is settled. But the peace God gives doesn't wait for the storm to end. It enters while the winds are still howling. It arrives in the middle of the courtroom, in the hospital hallway, in the sleepless night, in the I don't know what to do moment. And it doesn't shout. It just holds you, anchors you. It makes no logical sense to the people around you. and sometimes not even to yourself, because nothing changed externally, yet something has changed inside. That's how you know it's supernatural. It's not a peace you manufactured. It's not a result of you thinking positive or reading self-help mantras. It's not about ignoring your emotions or pretending you're okay. It's deeper than that. This kind of peace, the peace that passes all understanding, is not the absence of trouble. It's the undeniable presence of God. And sometimes, it's the only way He lets you know He's near. He doesn't always remove the pressure. Sometimes, He gives you a steady heart within it. But we've been conditioned to believe that God's presence is only proven when things go well. So when we feel peace while things are still falling apart, we question it, we push it away. We tell ourselves it's false hope or that we're being naive. But that's exactly the trap. Because if the enemy can get you to doubt the peace, he can pull you back into the panic. And if he can pull you back into the panic, you become distracted again, unable to hear, unable to see, unable to discern. You see, when God gives peace in the middle of chaos, He's not ignoring your pain. He's speaking louder than it. He's not asking you to deny reality. He's inviting you to access His reality, a reality where He already knows the outcome, where He already has provision in motion, where the very thing you're worried about is already under control, even if you can't see the evidence yet. And when you start to trust that peace as a sign of His presence, not as a coincidence or a coping mechanism, you'll stop second-guessing it. You'll start following it. Because sometimes peace is the confirmation. You prayed for an answer, and it didn't come as a dream or a prophecy or a voice. It came as a stillness in your spirit. You walked into the room and felt calm, and you couldn't explain why. You were about to make a decision, and suddenly your thoughts slowed, your fear quieted, and you felt a quiet yes. Or you were about to say yes to something, and suddenly the peace left, replaced by pressure, by restlessness, by a fog. That wasn't your mind changing randomly. That was spiritual alignment, or the loss of it. The world often teaches us to make decisions based on data, on logic, on consensus. But the kingdom of God works differently. Sometimes the only proof you have that you're on the right path is the peace you feel walking it. And that's not weak faith, it's mature faith. Faith that understands God doesn't always speak in dramatic events. Sometimes He speaks in the absence of anxiety, in the subtle yet unshakable knowing that you don't have to figure everything out right now because someone greater already has. This is how God trains you to trust Him, not through control, but through surrender. Not through having every answer, but through having one unexplainable peace that says, I'm with you in this. And the more you experience that, the more you'll begin to discern when something looks good but doesn't carry peace, versus when something looks terrifying but your spirit feels calm. That's when you start living above circumstances. That's when your faith becomes more than belief. It becomes vision. And I get it. Sometimes peace feels dangerous, especially when everything around you is screaming for panic. When your bank account is empty, when the diagnosis is uncertain, when the job is unstable, when the relationship is crumbling. Feeling calm in the middle of that can feel wrong, like you're ignoring the gravity of the situation. But hear me clearly, God's peace doesn't disrespect your situation, it redefines it. It's not ignorance, it's insight. It's evidence that heaven knows something you don't. And it's heaven's way of inviting you to walk by that knowing instead of walking by fear. Some of you right now are in the middle of chaos. You've been searching for a sign, for clarity, for something to tell you what to do. And maybe what you've been overlooking is the peace, or the lack of it. Maybe God has already answered you, not through words, but through the atmosphere of your soul. And if you pay attention to that, you might begin to hear Him in a way you never have before. So if this speaks to you, if you've ever felt that supernatural calm when everything was falling apart, drop it in the comments. Write, God calmed my chaos. Or share the moment you knew it was Him because of the peace. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to trust the stillness they feel right now. There's a space between night and morning where the spiritual world feels strangely close, where your mind is resting, your defenses are down, and your soul becomes more sensitive. In that space, when your body sleeps but your spirit stays alert, God sometimes speaks in a language deeper than logic. Dreams. Not just random images or leftover thoughts from the day, but vivid moments that stir you when you wake up, that haunt you in a good way, that leave a residue you can't ignore. And yet in the rush of life, so many people dismiss them. They say it was just a dream, a deed, but what if it wasn't? What if that dream was a divine warning? What if it was a redirection sent from heaven while your mind was finally quiet enough to receive it? We live in a culture that glorifies hustle and noise. Sleep is often seen as weakness. Rest is undervalued. And because of that, many miss one of the most powerful ways God can speak. Not in the hours we perform, but in the hours we surrender. Dreams in Scripture were never random. God gave Joseph the future of Egypt while he slept. He warned the wise men not to return to Herod through a dream. He redirected Joseph, Mary's husband, to flee with Jesus in the middle of the night through a dream. The Bible isn't subtle about this. God still speaks when the world is silent. And here's what most people don't realize. Dreams are not just about images. They're about impressions. Sometimes you don't even remember every detail, but you wake up with a feeling, with a phrase echoing in your heart, with a sense that something is shifting. That's God. That's His Spirit stirring something in you that your waking mind hasn't caught up with yet. And the danger is when you dismiss that, when you ignore the dream because you can't explain it, when you brush off the feeling just because it didn't come through a sermon or a prophecy. But some of the clearest messages you'll ever receive from God will come while you're not trying to hear them, because He's not limited to your conscious moments. Sometimes God gives dreams because He knows you wouldn't listen during the day. You've been too busy, too stressed, too surrounded by voices, scrolling through distractions, looking for signs in the noise. So He waits. He waits until you lay your head down. He waits until the fear isn't shouting so loud. And then He whispers. And when He does, it's not always poetic. Sometimes it's unsettling. Sometimes it wakes you up in a sweat. Sometimes it leaves you crying without knowing why. That's not to scare you. It's to shake you, to alert you, to redirect you before you take a step that could lead to destruction. Dreams are often God's early warning system. You've been praying for clarity. You've been asking Him to close doors, to show you the truth, to keep you safe. And while you expected Him to answer through conversation or coincidence, He came in a dream. He showed you someone's true heart. He exposed something hidden. He warned you about a move, a place, a deal, a decision. But the question is, did you pay attention? Or did you roll over and forget? This is where spiritual maturity comes in. Because if you're walking closely with God, you'll start to treat your dreams like messages. You'll start writing them down. You'll start praying over them. You'll start asking, God, what were you trying to show me? And the more you do that, the clearer His voice becomes. Not because He starts speaking more, but because you start listening better. The dream is not the end of the message, it's the beginning. And the response you give to that dream might be the difference between stepping into danger or stepping into purpose. And let's not ignore the other side of this. The enemy also knows how vulnerable we are in our dreams. That's why nightmares are real. That's why some dreams leave you feeling heavy, anxious, and afraid. But even that can be used by God to reveal where the spiritual warfare is, to show you what to pray against, to open your eyes to battles that are happening beyond your physical life. Don't underestimate what happens while you sleep. The spirit realm does not rest. But thank God, neither does He. You may not be a dreamer in the traditional sense. Maybe you rarely remember what you see when you sleep. Maybe your dreams don't come in vivid colors or clear scenes, but pay attention. Has there ever been a moment where you woke up with clarity you didn't have the night before? Has a decision ever become easier after a night of unexplainable peace? Has a person ever come to your mind in a dream and then crossed your path the next day? These aren't coincidences, these are clues. God is always speaking. The question is, are we resting enough to hear him? If you've ever had a dream that felt different, that stayed with you, that made you question what it really meant, I want you to tell me. Drop a comment and write, "God warned me in a dream," or share what you saw, what you felt, even if it didn't make sense. You never know who's had a similar dream, and your story might be the confirmation they've been searching for. Waiting can feel like the hardest thing to do when your heart is full of expectation. You've prayed, you've believed, you've made room in your life for the breakthrough you're hoping for, and yet, nothing. The doors stay closed, the calls don't come, the relationship doesn't move forward. The healing hasn't arrived, and in the silence of that delay, your mind begins to spiral. Maybe God changed his mind. Maybe you missed the moment. Maybe this was never meant for you in the first place. But what if I told you that what you're calling delay is actually protection? What if God is not withholding something from you, he's holding something off for you? There's a difference, because we tend to assume that when things don't move at our pace, something's wrong. We look at the calendar and the clock and start to panic. The world moves fast, and we've learned to measure progress by speed. But God's timeline is not built on urgency, it's built on preparation. And sometimes he delays the answer not because you're unworthy of the blessing, but because he's still preparing the space where that blessing will land. Or maybe he's still preparing you to carry it. Think about this. What if God gave you everything you're asking for right now, but your character wasn't ready to sustain it? What if he opened the door today, and you walked into it with wounds still bleeding, with insecurities still screaming, with a heart that hasn't healed enough to recognize the difference between opportunity and temptation? That's not a gift, that's sabotage. And God, in his mercy, would rather disappoint your timeline than damage your destiny. So he shields you. He holds you back. He lets it look like nothing is happening when in reality everything is happening, just not where you can see it yet. This is where trust becomes real. Not when everything is working, but when nothing is visible and yet you still believe something's being built. Behind the curtain of your unanswered prayers, God is working through a network of details you couldn't possibly control. He's moving pieces, aligning people, softening hearts, blocking danger, clearing paths. And because he knows exactly what's ahead, he also knows when to say, "Not yet." That phrase can be the most painful, but it's also one of the most powerful. It doesn't mean no. It means not like this, not right now, not until it's safe. We forget that spiritual maturity is not just about hearing God's yes, it's about trusting his not yet. Because the longer you walk with him, the more you'll realize that delay is often where he develops your discernment. In the waiting, you learn how to recognize what's real and what's counterfeit. In the stillness, you discover what your faith is rooted in. Was it in the outcome or in the God who oversees it? Delay reveals motives. It refines focus. It purifies desire. And most of all, it protects from premature exposure. What looks like closed doors might be locked for a reason, to keep you safe until what's on the other side is ready to hold you without harming you. And it's not just about you. Sometimes the delay isn't about your process, it's about theirs. The person you're meant to partner with might still be healing. The space you're meant to enter might still be toxic. The mission you're meant to step into might still be incomplete. And instead of putting you in a place where you'd have to fight battles you're not called to fight, God waits. He holds you in his timing because his protection is not just physical, it's emotional, relational, and spiritual. But here's the real struggle. When the enemy sees your delay, he'll try to turn it into disappointment. He'll start whispering lies like, "God forgot you," "You're being punished," "Other people are moving forward but you're stuck." And if you're not anchored in truth, you'll start to believe that the wait is evidence of abandonment, when in fact, it's evidence of attention. God sees you so clearly, values you so deeply, that he refuses to give you less than what's best. Even if that means you have to walk through a season that feels invisible, Because favor isn't always flashy. Sometimes it's hidden. You might not see the shield that's surrounding you right now. You might not know the traps he's dismantling or the storms he's diverting. But one day you will. One day you'll look back and thank God for the things he didn't allow, for the people who didn't stay, for the opportunities that didn't open, for the silence that forced you to listen more closely. You'll realize that delay was never a punishment. It was a pause that protected your purpose. So I want to ask you, has there ever been a moment where you were frustrated with God's timing, only to later realize he saved you from something you didn't even know was coming? If that's ever happened to you, I want you to comment right now. The delay was protection, or tell me how the pause gave you clarity. Your words might be the reassurance someone else needs while they're still in their waiting season. It's often the smallest voice that carries the greatest weight. A sudden hesitation, a quiet nudge, a random thought that barely lasted a few seconds, so brief that you almost dismissed it. Maybe it came right before you said yes to something. Maybe it interrupted your routine, made you pause for just a moment, urged you to turn back, to stay home, to say no, to wait. And in the rush of everything, it didn't feel like much. But later, sometimes hours, sometimes weeks, sometimes years, you realize that tiny, almost ignored thought was the very thing that saved you, not just from inconvenience, but from heartbreak, from danger, from spiritual entanglement. That wasn't a coincidence. That was the Holy Spirit, disguised as a whisper. We're always looking for big signs. We want confirmation that's loud, undeniable, dramatic. But the way God moves is often so subtle it feels ordinary, until we look back and realize how extraordinary it truly was. He speaks in what many call instinct, but when you walk with him long enough, you start to recognize the difference between your own intuition and divine interruption. That second of resistance that didn't make sense. That was him. That change of mind you couldn't explain. That was him. The delay that made you frustrated, but then something bad happened at the time you would have been there. That was him. And the more you grow spiritually, the more sensitive you become to those quiet, protective moments that don't shout for attention, but carry divine instruction. This is what makes discernment so powerful. Not just the ability to sense evil, but the ability to catch God's subtle movements. And here's what's dangerous. If you're constantly distracted, constantly doubting, constantly busy, you'll miss them. You'll brush them off. You'll call them overthinking. You'll keep moving. And when the consequence hits, you'll say, "Something told me not to." But it wasn't just something, it was someone. I can't tell you how many people have come face to face with a moment that could have changed or ended their lives, and the only thing that kept them from it was a thought they almost ignored. A voice that said, "Don't go," or "Not now," or "Check again." Some say it was luck. Some say it was gut feeling. But when you've learned to recognize the rhythm of God's voice, you know. You know he speaks like that because he's not just directing your destiny, he's protecting your path. This is why it matters so much to stay spiritually aligned, because you never know when that one small thought could be the difference between stepping into peace or walking into a trap. And the truth is, most of the time, it won't feel spiritual. It won't feel holy. It won't be accompanied by goosebumps or tears. It might actually feel confusing. You may wrestle with it. You may think, "That doesn't make sense," or "I'm probably just being paranoid." But God doesn't speak to impress you. He speaks to protect you. And obedience isn't about always understanding. It's about trusting enough to respond. And let's talk about the times we didn't respond. The moments we did ignore the thought. We brushed it off. We went anyway. We said yes when we knew we should have said no. And what followed was pain we could have avoided. That doesn't mean God abandoned us. It means he tried to warn us. It means his love was present, even when we didn't listen. And here's the grace in that. He'll still meet you in the aftermath. He'll still redeem what you went through. But sometimes that experience is what sharpens your ear for the next time. It trains you to take those little thoughts more seriously, because now you know what happens when you don't. There's something sacred about responding to the seemingly insignificant. It's the kind of obedience that moves heaven. Because God doesn't just speak in grand gestures, He speaks in moments that most people overlook. And when you start honoring those moments, everything shifts. Your spiritual awareness grows, your peace deepens. You stop second-guessing every decision because you start trusting that voice inside that gently says, "Turn here, call them, don't sign it, wait." This is also where spiritual maturity separates from emotional reaction. Because sometimes God will tell you to pull back when everything around you says push forward. And if you rely only on logic or emotion, you'll miss it. That's why walking in the Spirit is not just about praise and worship. It's about learning to stop when He says stop, even if you can't explain why. It's about trusting that the voice you almost ignored might be the very reason you're still standing. So let me ask you, has there ever been a moment where something in you whispered a warning and you almost didn't listen? And when you finally realized what could have happened if you hadn't stopped, it shook you. If that's ever been you, I want you to comment right now, "The whisper saved me," or share the story. Even if it seems small to others, your obedience in that moment may have been the shield God used to guard your life. Your story might be the very thing someone else needs to listen more closely today. There's a kind of love that doesn't always feel like comfort. It feels like conflict. A love that steps in not to give you what you want, but to stop you from what would have destroyed you. It's the love of a God who sees deeper than your feelings, stronger than your will, and more clearly than your plans. Sometimes God will shut a door not because you asked Him to, but because He knew you wouldn't have the strength to walk away on your own. He blocks it because He knows how much of your heart was already tied up in something that would have unraveled you slowly. It's mercy, but it feels like loss. This is where it gets personal because we don't like to admit our weakness. We want to believe we could have let go when the time was right, that we would have seen the red flags, that we were strong enough to leave. But the truth is, when you're emotionally invested, when you've built dreams around a person, a place, a season, a version of your future, you don't walk away easily. You justify, you hope, you compromise, and God, in His mercy, doesn't wait for you to self-destruct. He steps in, He blocks the number, He removes the option, He exposes the lie, and it hurts. It feels like betrayal, but it's actually intervention. Some of the deepest heartbreaks in your life weren't about rejection, they were about protection. God saw what was ahead and decided to intervene before your soul got too entangled, before your identity got too confused, before you lost more years trying to fix what was never yours to carry. But we don't always see it that way in the moment. We mourn what we lost. We beg for it back. We pray for God to restore what He Himself removed. And we don't realize that sometimes the closed door is the most spiritual answer we could have received. There's something humbling about being rescued from yourself, about admitting that you weren't as strong as you thought, and that maybe, just maybe, God's interruption saved your calling. Because the truth is, we don't always choose what's good for us. Sometimes we choose what's familiar, what feels good, what looks promising. And God, as a loving Father, knows when to say, enough. He doesn't always ask permission. He doesn't wait for your full understanding. He acts because He knows the future cost of your present compromise. This isn't about shame. It's about awakening, about realizing that some of the things that slipped through your fingers were never meant to be held, about understanding that what looked like loss was divine rescue in disguise. And if you really think about it, there are moments in your past that prove it. The job you didn't get, the person who left, the dream that crumbled. At the time it felt like failure, but now you can see how it cleared the path for something healthier, holier, more aligned with who you're becoming. And let's be honest, it's exhausting trying to hold together what God is trying to dismantle. When you're clinging to something that no longer fits your calling, everything starts to feel heavy. Your peace disappears. Your clarity fades. You start to shrink to fit inside a life that was never designed to carry your growth, and yet letting go still feels like dying. That's why God steps in, not to control you, but to free you. Because even if your spirit knows it's time to leave, your heart can still hesitate. That's when He blocks it, not to punish, but to protect. This is where faith matures, not in the receiving, but in the releasing. When you start to trust that God's no is just as holy as His yes. When you start to thank Him for the things He didn't allow, even before you understand why. Because deep down, you know He's not trying to take from you, He's trying to save you. And sometimes, the greatest evidence of His presence isn't what He gives, but what He takes away, quietly, suddenly, completely. You may not have seen it at first. You may have cried, screamed, even questioned your worth when it happened. But now, looking back, can you see the hand of God? Can you see how much pain was avoided because He blocked what you couldn't yet let go of? That's not weakness. That's grace. That's divine strength showing up where yours ran out. And that kind of love, uncomfortable, protective, wise, is what transforms your perspective. You stop fighting the block. You start thanking God for it. So tell me, has there ever been a moment where something was forcefully removed from your life and only later did you realize it was protection? If that's ever happened to you, I want you to drop it in the comments. Write, God blocked what I couldn't. Or tell the story. Someone else might be trying to hold on to something that's hurting them, and your words could be the moment they realize it's okay to let go. There are moments when everything around you seems fine. Nothing is visibly wrong, nothing urgent is happening, no crisis is present. Yet deep inside, you feel unsettled. You go through the motions. You try to stay focused, but your heart keeps racing. Your mind wanders. You feel distracted, disconnected, like something isn't right, but you can't explain why. That internal turbulence, that emotional friction, it's not always anxiety in the way the world defines it. Sometimes it's a signal from God. Sometimes it's not your mind reacting to stress, but your spirit responding to a shift in the atmosphere. And this is where many people get confused, because we've been taught that discomfort must always have a natural cause. We search for explanations. Maybe it's exhaustion, maybe it's pressure, maybe it's our to-do list, or hormones, or a lack of sleep. And yes, those things are real. But not every storm is physical. Sometimes your soul knows something your brain hasn't caught up with yet. Sometimes the unrest you feel is divine. It's a holy alert. It's heaven letting you know. Pay attention. Something is moving. This is the language of the Spirit. And if you're not spiritually aware, you'll mislabel it. You'll try to numb it with distractions. You'll scroll, eat, binge watch, overwork, anything to silence the restlessness. But when it's God trying to get your attention, no amount of distraction will bring peace. Because peace doesn't come from avoiding discomfort. It comes from responding to its message. And the message isn't always, you're in danger. Sometimes it's simply, you've outgrown this, or there's more, or this isn't where I want you to stay. That kind of restlessness doesn't show up as panic, it shows up as tension. You sit in a room and suddenly feel like you don't belong there anymore. You talk to someone you used to feel deeply connected to, and something feels different. You walk into your job, your ministry, your routine, and nothing is wrong, but nothing feels right either. That's not just mood. That's not just tiredness. That's a spiritual indicator. That's your discernment waking up. That's the whisper of the Holy Spirit reminding you that your season might be shifting, and if you try to hold on to where you were, you'll miss where God is leading you next. And the most dangerous thing we can do in that moment is suppress it. When you ignore divine restlessness long enough, it turns into frustration. You start feeling stuck. You start questioning your purpose. You start resenting the very places God once used to bless you. Not because they're suddenly evil, but because they've expired, and anything you cling to after its expiration becomes toxic, no matter how good it once was. That's why God sends restlessness before He sends release. It's His way of saying, start preparing to move. But here's what we don't like. That movement rarely comes with clear instructions at first. God doesn't always say, "Leave now," or "Change this today." He starts with discomfort. He stirs your spirit. He allows the grace to shift slowly. And your job is not to panic. It's to lean in, ask questions, spend time in stillness, fast, pray, get quiet. Not because you're being punished, but because you're being positioned. The discomfort isn't a problem to fix. It's an invitation to discern. And if you're not careful, you'll confuse that divine unease with something being wrong with you. You'll think you're broken, inconsistent, dramatic. You'll think you're ungrateful for wanting more. But listen, just because you're uncomfortable doesn't mean you're unfaithful. God doesn't always move us when things are bad. Sometimes He moves us when things are comfortable, so we don't get stuck in a place that was only meant to be a transition. Don't wait for everything to fall apart before you allow Him to shift you. Honor the warning before it becomes a wake-up call. There's a reason you haven't been able to settle. There's a reason why things that used to excite you now feel empty. Why you can't find peace in routines that used to bring joy. Your soul is responding to a greater calling. And instead of labeling that as anxiety, start seeing it as alignment. That stirring is sacred. It's heaven pressing against your heart, saying, "It's time to come closer. I'm doing something new. Don't resist it." We often pray for clarity, for doors to open, for direction to be obvious. But we don't always recognize when the first sign is internal. God rarely yells. He often begins by shifting the ground beneath your feet, just enough to make you feel the imbalance. And it's not meant to make you fall, it's meant to make you move. So the next time you feel that restlessness, don't suppress it, don't run from it, sit with it. Ask God, "What are you trying to show me through this?" And don't be surprised when He starts rearranging things you thought were settled. Because the discomfort isn't the end, it's the beginning of something you haven't seen yet. So let me ask you, have you felt that lately? That spiritual unease, that internal stirring, that whisper that you're being pulled in a new direction, but you're not sure why? If that's you, I want you to drop it in the comments right now. Write, "I feel the shift," or tell me what's been stirring in you. Don't underestimate the power of naming what you're sensing. Your comment might confirm exactly what someone else is quietly going through right now. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels sacred. You pray and don't hear an answer. You ask for a sign, but nothing changes. You seek confirmation, but everything stays quiet. And in that quiet, you begin to wonder if God has gone silent on you. But what if I told you that His silence isn't absence? What if the silence itself is the message? What if God isn't ignoring you? He's inviting you to listen in a new way. Because sometimes the loudest answers from heaven come wrapped in stillness, and you only begin to hear them when you stop expecting sound. This part of your journey isn't about God shouting from the clouds. It's about Him whispering through your awareness. The world will tell you that silence means nothing is happening. But in the kingdom of God, silence often means something deeper is shifting, something beneath the surface, something not meant to be heard, but sensed. Silence is not a void. It's a space that God uses to mature your faith, to slow your steps, and to heighten your spiritual senses. We are trained to associate communication with noise, with action, with obvious movement. But God doesn't always respond on our terms. He's not limited to our definitions of interaction. In fact, some of the most intimate moments you'll have with God will be the ones where no words are spoken. Because in silence, all the external distractions fade. In silence, your inner world becomes louder. That's where God begins to surface what's been buried. That's where He begins to reveal what you haven't been able to see, not through information, but through awareness, through presence. You've probably had that moment. You sat in prayer expecting a word, but nothing came. And yet, you left feeling strangely grounded. more at peace, a little more focused. That's not emptiness. That's God calibrating your spirit. It's not about hearing something new. It's about becoming someone new through the quiet. Silence is not punishment. It's preparation. And when God is silent, it doesn't mean he's far. It often means he's closer than ever, working on the parts of your life that don't need noise, but need transformation. But this is where it gets difficult, because silence can be painful when you're desperate for direction. You ask, God, should I stay or should I go? Silence. Should I say yes to this or walk away? Silence. Is this the person I'm meant to build with, or am I wasting my time? Silence. And in those moments, doubt creeps in. You begin to question not just the situation, but your relationship with God. You start wondering if he still cares, if you've done something wrong, if you've missed a signal somewhere along the way. But here's what you need to understand. God's silence is not always about you lacking faith. It's about you learning trust. It's about developing a relationship that doesn't rely on constant confirmation, but that lives in quiet confidence. God knows how to speak loud enough to be heard when something is urgent. So if he's silent, it's not neglect, it's intentional. It's an opportunity for you to pause and reflect. Maybe the answer is already in your spirit and you're being asked to walk it out. Maybe the next move requires stillness, not speed. Maybe God is building your sensitivity so you don't become addicted to instruction, but attuned to alignment. And here's something else we don't talk about enough. Sometimes God is silent because he already spoke. You're asking again, but he already gave the instruction last season. He already told you to leave that place, but you stayed. He already told you to forgive that person, but you held on. He already told you what your next step was, but you hesitated. And now you're sitting in silence, not because he's holding back, but because he's waiting. Not for you to ask again, but for you to move on what you already know. This silence is holy. It's not cold. It's not indifferent. It's sacred. And it will shape you more than any loud answer ever could. Because when you learn to trust God, even when he's quiet, your relationship with him deepens beyond emotional highs or spiritual fireworks. It becomes rooted in real faith, the kind of faith that doesn't flinch in the dark, the kind of faith that keeps walking when the path isn't lit, the kind of faith that says, even if I don't hear him right now, I know he's with me. And maybe that's exactly where you are right now. Maybe you've been begging God to speak, to act, to move, and the only thing you've received is stillness. I want to tell you, don't run from it. Don't resent it. Press into it. There's something in the silence that you can't get from the noise. There's a depth of intimacy that only grows in the quiet. Let it do its work in you. So I want to ask you, have you ever been in a season where God went silent and only later did you realize he was doing something profound behind the scenes? If that's you, share it below. Write the phrase, God spoke through the silence. Or tell me what this silent season has been revealing to you. Someone else might be in the same place right now, and your words could be the quiet answer they've been searching for. There comes a moment in your journey where the things that once filled you start to feel strangely empty. What once inspired you begins to feel like a burden. The conversations that used to light you up now leave you drained. The environment that used to feel like home suddenly feels foreign, and it's confusing, even painful, because nothing around you has changed, but something inside you has. That shift, that quiet disconnection from what you once loved, is not always burnout. It's not boredom. It's not emotional instability. Sometimes it's God pulling you away, not to punish you, but to prepare you, to transition you from one season to another, to detach you from something good, because he's calling you towards something greater. This kind of shift is subtle at first. It doesn't always come with a loud break or dramatic event. Instead, it starts with discomfort, a sense that something doesn't fit anymore. You try to force it, try to recapture the old feeling, the old rhythm, but it never feels the same. And the danger in this moment is thinking that something is wrong with you, that your passion is gone, that your fire is dying. But in reality, it might be that God is closing a chapter you were never meant to live in forever. One of the most misunderstood aspects of growth is the loss of attachment, because we think that when God blesses something, we're supposed to hold on to it forever. But blessing has a season, and when its purpose is complete, what once felt like alignment starts to feel like resistance. You keep showing up, but your spirit keeps checking out. You keep trying to make it work, but nothing flows. That's not failure. That's transition. That's the Holy Spirit gently loosening your grip on something you didn't realize had become an idol. Not because it was evil, but because it was enough to get you here, but not enough to take you there. And this is where things get emotional, because letting go of what you once loved can feel like betrayal. It feels like you're walking away from something sacred. But God doesn't pull you away without purpose. He doesn't extract you from a place, a person, a purpose without planting something new on the other side. But before He gives you the new, He has to create space. He has to detach you emotionally, mentally, spiritually, so you don't carry yesterday's comfort into tomorrow's calling. Some of the hardest seasons in your life won't be when things are bad. They'll be when things are no longer right. When you're standing in a place that still looks blessed, but no longer feels like home. And the temptation will be to hold on, to keep pretending it fits, to avoid the pain of change. But the longer you stay where you no longer belong, the more misaligned your spirit becomes, the more drained you feel, the more peace slips away. And deep down, you know it. God is shifting me, not in judgment, in love, because He knows if you don't let go, you won't have room to receive what He's about to reveal. This pulling away isn't rejection, it's refinement. He's making room for deeper connection, higher impact, greater purpose. And yes, there's grief in that process, there's loss. You'll miss the version of you that once thrived in that space. You'll miss the feeling of being settled, but you weren't created to settle. You were created to evolve. And with every shift God initiates, He's calling you into a version of yourself that's more aligned with who He made you to be. And the people around you won't always understand it. They'll say, "You've changed," or "Why would you walk away from something so good?" And you won't always have a clear answer, because this isn't a logical move. It's a spiritual one. You're being led by peace, not permission. By the quiet, knowing that your soul is no longer rooted in what used to feed it. That your soil has changed, that your season has shifted, and if you try to stay, you'll only stunt your growth. That's why it's so important to discern the difference between quitting and obeying. Quitting is leaving out of fear. Obedience is walking away out of faith. Faith that trusts what you're feeling, even when it doesn't make sense. Faith that believes if God is pulling you away, He's already prepared something that will pull you forward. Something more aligned with your maturity, your mission, your identity. So let me ask you, have you been feeling disconnected from something that used to bring you joy? Have you felt God slowly pulling your heart in another direction, even though nothing external has changed? If this resonates with you, I want you to drop it in the comments. Write, "I'm being pulled for purpose," or share what you feel you're being asked to release. You're not the only one. And your words might help someone else realize that what feels like loss is really the start of a divine shift. There's a tension that exists between who you are now and who you're becoming. It's not always dramatic, but it's always present. You feel it in the waiting seasons, in the quiet days where nothing seems to move, in the invisible process that makes you question if anything is really happening at all. But what if I told you that God's silence isn't just silence, and your current stillness isn't just delay? What if the reason things aren't accelerating is because you're being prepared for something so weighty, so purposeful, so deeply significant, that if it were handed to you today, it would crush you? Not because you're incapable, but because preparation always comes before release. It's not that you're not called. It's not that the vision was wrong. It's not that the promise has expired. It's that God is shaping the vessel before pouring in the oil, and shaping takes time, fire, pressure, isolation, deep inner work, the kind of transformation that rarely shows on the surface at first, but completely reconstructs what's happening beneath. That's the part we don't talk about enough. Everyone wants the elevation, the open door, the divine assignment, but few want the season where God stretches you in private, builds your character, purifies your motives, confronts your ego, and prepares you to carry what's coming with humility and wisdom. And here's what makes it more difficult. The preparation doesn't always feel spiritual. Sometimes it just feels like life is breaking you down. You lose people, you lose plans, you face disappointment, delay, disruption. Things you thought were secure begin to shake. Opportunities vanish without reason. And in your humanity, you assume you're being punished. But you're not being punished. You're being trusted. Trusted to be broken without bitterness. Trusted to wait without explanation. Trusted to keep walking when nothing is clear. That kind of development can't be taught. It can only be lived. This is how God prepares leaders. This is how He prepares voices. This is how He builds people who don't just perform publicly, but stand in private integrity. Because gifting can open a door, but only character can keep you in the room. And the version of you today may be anointed, but that doesn't mean you're yet equipped. God sees the version of you 5 years from now, the one leading, healing, building, carrying weight. And He also sees the areas in you that would collapse under pressure if they're not strengthened now. That's why certain things aren't happening yet. That's why you keep circling the same lesson. That's why the door hasn't opened, even though you've prayed, fasted, and obeyed. Because God knows what's on the other side, and He won't let you walk into it until your foundation is ready. He loves you too much to rush you. He loves your purpose too much to expose you before you're mature enough to steward it. And this kind of love doesn't always feel good. It feels like resistance. But it's actually protection disguised as delay. You don't have to look far in Scripture to see this pattern. Moses spent 40 years in the desert before leading people out of Egypt. Joseph endured betrayal and prison before stepping into power. David was anointed as king, but returned to tending sheep. Jesus Himself waited 30 years before stepping into public ministry. Preparation is not the enemy of purpose. It's the soil that grows it. But we get so caught up in the timeline, in the pressure to be visible, in the temptation to prove we're ready, that we forget this simple truth. God doesn't care about speed. He cares about strength. And strength isn't built when everything is easy. It's built in seasons of surrender. Right now, you might feel like nothing is happening, but I need you to hear this. Everything is happening. The healing, the pruning, the stretching. The unseen moments when you say yes in private, when you forgive in silence, when you let go of things no one knew you were carrying. These are the moments that make you trustworthy. These are the roots growing deep so that the fruit can last. And if you rush past them, if you despise this season, you'll enter the next one with holes you didn't notice. Holes that can leak purpose and damage promise. That's why God is being so careful with you. That's why He hasn't allowed the platform to come yet. That's why the answer is still wait, because what He's building in you isn't shallow. It's not temporary. It's generational. It's legacy. And legacy doesn't grow fast. It grows strong. So while you're praying for acceleration, heaven might be working on excavation, digging deeper so that what's built won't fall when the wind comes. So I want to ask you, have you been feeling frustrated with a season that seems slow, silent, or even stagnant? Have you questioned your purpose because nothing visible is confirming it right now? If so, drop it in the comments and let's talk. Write, God is preparing me in silence. Or share what area of your life feels like it's being stretched. Because chances are you're not being left behind. You're just being built differently. And your breakthrough will be that much sweeter because of it. It happens quietly, unexpectedly, often in the most mundane parts of your day. You're driving, working, washing dishes, walking into a room, scrolling your phone, and suddenly a subtle yet undeniable thought enters your mind. Pray. Maybe it's not even a full sentence. Maybe it's just a tug, a pause in your spirit, a strange inner shift, and you think to yourself, that's random. You brush it off. You keep moving. But something lingers. The thought doesn't leave. It stays with you, waiting, as if heaven has tapped on your shoulder mid-moment to whisper, talk to me, now. That is not coincidence. That is not your imagination. That is a divine invitation, one many people ignore, not because they're rebellious, but because they don't recognize the urgency behind the whisper. We often treat prayer as something scheduled, morning devotion, evening reflection, church gatherings. And while those rhythms are important, they don't replace the spontaneity of divine communication. God is not confined to ritual. He speaks in real time, in the cracks between your calendar entries, in the unexpected seconds where your heart is suddenly drawn to him. That unplanned thought to pray is not just a suggestion, it's often a strategy, a warning, a redirection, or even a rescue. There is a deep spiritual intelligence behind that moment. Because what you didn't see is what was happening in the unseen realm. Maybe someone was speaking your name in intercession. Maybe the enemy had just launched an attack against your peace. Maybe God needed your agreement on something unfolding in another person's life. You were minding your own business, but heaven wasn't. Heaven was orchestrating, aligning, intervening, and God, in his sovereignty, chose you to be a part of it. Not later, but right now. And here's the part that stirs me the most. Many of the most significant spiritual breakthroughs don't begin with a sermon, a song, or a service. They begin with a whisper, an unshakable internal invitation to just pause and pray, not because you feel holy, not because you had time set aside, but because God knows the exact second your agreement, your words, your attention will shift the atmosphere, yours or someone else's. That's why the enemy fights it so hard. That's why your mind suddenly remembers a task you forgot, why a notification pops up, why you feel restless, because hell understands what happens when heaven gets your attention. The thought to pray isn't small, it's warfare. You might not feel goosebumps. You might not have eloquent words, but in that moment, obedience is more powerful than emotion. God doesn't need perfect phrasing. He needs your yes. Even if it's one sentence, even if it's a whisper back to him, I'm here, I'm listening. And that's where intimacy grows. Not just in set-apart hours of devotion, but in the raw, real moments where God says, talk to me, and you respond in the middle of your routine. And let's go deeper. Sometimes that sudden urge to pray isn't about you at all. It's intercession. You're standing in the gap without even knowing it. You feel a heaviness but don't know where it's coming from. A name flashes in your mind, a place, a situation, and your first instinct is to shake it off. But what if that's exactly when someone needs covering? What if your simple prayer is the very thing that shifts the direction of someone else's day or even their life? We talk about being used by God, but we forget that sometimes it's as subtle as an unplanned prayer at 2:17 in the afternoon. There's power in learning to stop and say yes, to acknowledge that your spirit is not reacting randomly, it's responding to something bigger than you. You might never know what your prayer stopped, what it unlocked, what it delayed, what it birthed, but heaven does. And sometimes God lets you feel the ripple later. You find out someone was in danger, that they almost gave up, that they needed strength at the exact time you prayed, and you realize this wasn't coincidence. This was cooperation with God, a partnership that didn't begin with noise, but with a whisper. And for those who doubt whether it's really God, let me say this: the enemy will never invite you to pray. Your flesh won't randomly desire communion in the middle of distraction. That thought is not coming from you, it's coming through you, and your yes to it is more powerful than you realize. So let me ask you, have you ever had one of those moments where you felt the urge to pray, seemingly out of nowhere, and later realized why? Or maybe you're in that space right now where prayer has been tugging on your spirit more often, but you're not sure what to do with it. If this resonates, I want you to write in the comments, "God told me to pray, and I did." Or tell me about the moment you almost ignored the whisper but chose to listen instead, because your story might awaken someone else to recognize their own divine interruptions. Before danger shows up in your reality, it first echoes in your thoughts. That's something we're not taught often enough. We think spiritual battles only happen in the external world. Arguments, crises, conflicts, sudden disasters. But in truth, long before the enemy makes a move in your circumstances, he studies your patterns, your fears, your vulnerabilities. And long before you ever see his strategy play out in real life, God tries to warn you quietly, in your thoughts, in your spirit, in those subtle moments of tension or alertness that feel too small to explain, but too real to ignore. What you call overthinking might be divine protection in motion. What you labeled just a weird feeling might have been God planting an early warning before the enemy could get close. The mind is sacred territory. It's not just where you reason and reflect. It's where heaven and hell fight for influence. Every thought is a doorway. Some are harmless passing moments. Others are spiritual signals, invitations for you to either fall into confusion or step into clarity. And it's in this space that God often begins to whisper before the enemy has a chance to shout. That voice that says, check on your child, don't ignore that email, cancel that trip, be careful with that person. These are not just flashes of caution. These are seeds planted in your thoughts by a God who sees what you cannot see. It doesn't always feel spiritual, which is why so many miss it. It comes as an idea, a sudden concern, a random scenario that crosses your mind. You feel the weight of it but can't explain why. You try to brush it off as negativity, but it won't leave. And because we're taught to be logical, we push away anything that doesn't have visible evidence. But discernment isn't about seeing, it's about sensing. It's about recognizing that your thoughts are sometimes heaven's radar system, and when something triggers your inner alarm, you don't have to wait for confirmation in the natural to act in the spiritual. And here's where it gets even more intense. The enemy also knows how to work through the mind. He doesn't always attack your finances, your relationships, your opportunities. Sometimes his greatest attacks come as thoughts. Thoughts that plant fear, confusion, doubt, distraction, temptation. And if he can get you to ignore God's warnings and embrace the mental noise, he doesn't need to sabotage your life from the outside. He lets you do it from the inside. That's why Scripture says to take every thought captive, not just the obvious ones, the subtle ones too, because the most dangerous attack is the one that looks like your own reasoning, but was never from God. That's why you can't treat your mind like it's a neutral zone. It's not. It's a battleground. Every day you're deciding which voice gets authority. And the earlier you learn to recognize the whispers of warning, the faster you can shut down what was meant to destroy you. Sometimes the enemy's plan is delayed, not because he's weak, but because you listened early, because you said, that thought isn't mine, and I'm not going to follow it. Because you heard God say, pray now, and you did. Because you paid attention when something in your spirit felt off, even when everyone else said it was fine. You won't always get confirmation. You won't always see what could have happened. But that's the point. God's protection often looks like nothing happened at all. Because what could have happened never reached you. You were already shielded in your mind, already redirected in your spirit, already covered because you obeyed something you couldn't fully explain. That's where the real power is. That's where your spiritual strength lives, not in how loud you can shout, but in how sensitively you can listen. And you're not crazy for being that sensitive, for noticing patterns others ignore, for feeling heaviness when others are laughing, for sensing danger when everything looks normal. That's not paranoia, that's prophecy, that's discernment. That's what it means to walk with God, not just in church, but in thought, in private, in the inner spaces where battles are won or lost long before they manifest outside. So train your ear to listen, when that inner nudge comes. Don't wait until chaos erupts to recognize God was trying to speak. He plants warnings early. He moves in advance. And the more you honor those thoughts, the more you'll realize how deeply involved He is in your daily life. That's where trust grows. That's where safety is found, not in control, but in connection. Now let me ask you, has there ever been a time when a thought, a small warning in your mind, protected you from something that could have gone terribly wrong? Or maybe you didn't listen, and looking back, you realize God was trying to alert you. If so, I want you to drop it in the comments right now. Write, "God warned me early," or tell the story. Your moment of mental awareness might be the thing that teaches someone else how to hear the warnings in their own thoughts before it's too late. There are moments in life when everything makes sense on paper. The plan looks solid, the path feels clear, the opportunity seems perfect. All the facts are in place. The numbers align, the people agree. You've prayed, thought it through, analyzed every angle, and your conclusion feels logical. But then something strange happens. A resistance rises in your spirit. A discomfort begins to grow. You try to ignore it, tell yourself you're just nervous or being overly cautious. But no matter how many times you circle back to the plan, something won't settle. It doesn't make sense in your mind, but your spirit is unsettled. And that's where divine interruption begins. Because when God interrupts your logic, it's not to embarrass your intellect, it's to protect your soul. We are creatures of reasoning. We've been taught to trust what we see, what we calculate, what we can prove. But walking with God often requires a different posture, a deeper sensitivity to a wisdom that isn't always explainable. Because logic is limited to what you know, what you've seen, what others have taught you. But God operates from a higher dimension. He sees what you cannot. He sees motives hidden beneath charm. He sees consequences delayed by time. He sees traps dressed as blessings. And when He sees danger ahead, He sometimes disrupts your well-structured plan with a spiritual red flag that can't be justified through reason. That interruption might come in the form of a lack of peace. You try to move forward, but something pulls you back. You feel foggy, distracted, anxious, not in a fearful way, but in a protective way. You can't shake the thought that something is off. And because there's no tangible evidence, you keep trying to reason your way through it. But here's the thing. Faith is not the absence of logic. It's the ability to submit logic to the voice of God. It's saying, even though this makes sense naturally, I choose to trust the tension in my spirit more than the facts in front of me. And that kind of obedience is rare, because it doesn't always win applause. People will call you irrational, emotional, overly spiritual. They'll ask, but why are you walking away when everything is lined up? And sometimes you won't have an answer that satisfies them because you're not following a formula. You're following a voice. You're listening to the God who knows what's behind the door you're about to open. And if you honor that voice, if you listen to the interruption, you may avoid something that your mind would have never caught until it was too late. I can't tell you how many people have ignored the interruption because they didn't want to appear foolish. They stayed in that relationship, signed that deal, moved forward with that commitment because everything looked perfect. And months later, they sat in the fallout thinking, I knew something wasn't right, I felt it, but I didn't want to make waves. That moment of regret is often born from one decision, choosing logic over leading. And please understand, God is not anti-logic. He created your mind. He invites you to use wisdom, to consider counsel, to make plans. But those plans must remain surrendered, because when He speaks, your first responsibility is not to explain, it's to obey. Sometimes that means stopping when everything says go. Sometimes it means backing out of a room you fought to enter. Sometimes it means saying no to something you prayed for. Because once you got close, you realized it carried a weight your spirit wasn't built to carry. That's what spiritual maturity looks like. It's not about how much you know, it's about how quickly you obey when God redirects you. It's about trusting that even when your logic is offended, your soul is being shielded. Because God isn't trying to confuse you, He's trying to cover you. And if that means interrupting your perfectly structured, thoroughly researched, beautifully logical plan, He will. And here's the beauty. The more you learn to trust those interruptions, the more peace you'll walk in. You'll stop feeling torn between faith and reason, because you'll realize that true wisdom is not just in what's smart, but in what's spiritually safe. You'll start making decisions not just based on what looks good, but on what feels anchored. And when you live like that, you'll avoid heartache you never had to experience. You'll bypass battles you were never meant to fight, because you listened when the interruption came, even when it didn't make sense. So let me ask you, has God ever interrupted something that seemed perfect in your eyes? Has He ever placed a warning in your heart that defied logic, but later you saw why? If that's ever happened to you, I want you to write in the comments, "God interrupted my logic and saved me," or share your story. Someone out there is in the middle of a plan that feels right, but doesn't sit well in their spirit. And your experience might be the nudge they need to pause and listen. There's a kind of disconnection that doesn't start outside. It begins inside. You still show up, you're still present, you still perform, but something deep within you starts to detach. Conversations feel forced. Environments you used to love now feel heavy. The things that once motivated you don't stir you anymore. And at first, you think maybe you're just tired. Maybe you need rest. Maybe you're just burned out. But the truth is deeper. What you're experiencing is not just fatigue, it's divine disruption. Because when God wants to rewire your life for purpose, He often starts by disconnecting you from anything that no longer aligns with where He's taking you. We're so used to valuing connection that when disconnection shows up, we think we've done something wrong. We panic when we start feeling distance from people we used to be close with, or when our passion for certain dreams begins to fade. But not all disconnection is loss. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes God is subtracting things from your life that have quietly been subtracting from your spirit. Sometimes He pulls you away not to isolate you, but to insulate you, because you can't hear Him clearly while surrounded by voices that no longer speak to your destiny. This shift doesn't always make sense. You could be in the middle of a thriving job, a strong relationship, a successful season, and still feel the pull to step away. That's the uncomfortable part of obedience. It doesn't wait for logic to catch up. And God, in His wisdom, knows that the most dangerous place to be is one step past the grace of your current assignment. So before the atmosphere around you turns toxic, before the influence you're under starts numbing your sensitivity, He begins the process of disconnection. It often feels like internal restlessness, like you're living in a place your spirit has already left, and you'll try to fix it. You'll try to reattach. You'll try to find the old feeling again. You'll push through, stay loyal, try harder. But no matter how much you invest, you can't feel at home anymore. That's the sign, that's the whisper you can't ignore, that the place you're trying to stay in was only meant to carry you for a season, not a lifetime. And God, in His mercy, is giving you the grace to leave before the environment starts breaking down what He spent years building in you. Disconnection can feel like rejection, but it's often realignment. It's God's way of unplugging you from what's draining you so He can reconnect you to what's defining you. You'll begin to feel drawn to new things, places, ideas, voices, passions that you can't explain. That's your spirit remembering your assignment. That's the Holy Spirit pulling you back to what really matters, to who you really are. And sometimes the only way for God to reignite your purpose is to create space where nothing else fits anymore. Not because He wants you empty, but because He's about to fill you with something new. This kind of disconnection often comes with a deep emotional toll. You may grieve the version of you that thrived in your past season. You may question your identity, your worth, your direction. But this is the pruning. This is the cutting away of what can't go with you into your next chapter. And yes, it's painful, but it's also prophetic. Because God doesn't disconnect without a reason. There is something on the other side of this disconnection that will require your full attention, your full capacity, your full heart. And the longer you cling to what's already fading, the longer you delay the assignment that's waiting. And let's be honest, disconnection is lonely. It isolates you from familiar comfort zones. You might feel like no one understands what you're going through, like you're being left behind while others keep advancing. But what if you're not being left behind at all? What if you're being set apart? What if this quiet, slow season is actually divine preparation for rapid, undeniable purpose? You won't see it all now, but if you pay attention to what's being removed, and even more to what's being revealed inside you, you'll start to understand. This isn't a breakdown. It's a breakthrough in slow motion. And when you start embracing the disconnection, you'll notice something powerful. Clarity returns, peace grows, vision expands, the pressure to prove disappears, and you begin to breathe differently, pray differently, move differently, because you're no longer tethered to things that muted your voice. You're no longer performing for spaces that can't see your value. You're no longer wasting energy trying to resuscitate dead connections. You're free. And that freedom reconnects you with who you were before you got distracted, before you got drained, before you started living to be accepted. So let me ask you, have you been feeling that internal disconnection lately? Like God is quietly pulling you away from what no longer serves your soul, but you don't know where He's taking you next. If that's been your reality, write this in the comments right now. God is disconnecting me to reconnect me. Or share what you've had to walk away from, even without closure, just because you sensed it was time. Your honesty might be the confirmation someone else is looking for in this very same moment. There comes a season in every journey where you feel invisible. You're doing everything right. You're showing up. You're giving your best. You're staying consistent in secret, but no one seems to notice. The doors you were waiting on remain closed. The support you thought would surround you doesn't show up. You speak and it feels like no one's listening. You serve and it feels like no one sees. And somewhere between doing what's right and feeling overlooked, your heart starts asking, what's the point if no one even notices? But what if that very feeling of being unseen is actually divine training? What if God is allowing invisibility not to hurt your identity, but to secure it? This is the uncomfortable classroom where God teaches you that your worth doesn't come from applause. It doesn't come from validation, from recognition, from followers, from likes, from being celebrated. It comes from Him, from being known by the one who sees when no one else does, from being loved by the one who formed you in the womb, who called you before the crowds ever came, who named your purpose before a single person clapped for your gift. That kind of knowing is painful to learn, but once you learn it, it sets you free forever. Because once you know where your worth comes from, no one else can control it. We live in a world addicted to being seen. Visibility is currency. Influence is worshipped. If you're not visible, you're forgotten. That's the lie that culture feeds you, that your value is tied to your platform, your productivity, your performance. But God doesn't build you the same way the world builds stars. He builds you in silence. He strengthens you in solitude. He matures you in obscurity. He uses seasons of being hidden not to punish you, but to prepare you. Because when you finally are seen, He wants to make sure you're not addicted to the attention, but anchored in identity. This is why some doors haven't opened yet. It's why some recognition hasn't arrived. Not because you're not called, but because God is still doing the deeper work. Because if He gave you the stage before healing your need to be noticed, that stage would become a drug. You'd start performing for affirmation. You'd start needing the applause to feel secure. And God loves you too much to let you build a life where your identity is one crowd away from collapsing. So He pulls you aside. He takes you through the wilderness. And there, in the silence, He teaches you the rhythm of being known by Him. It's in this season that you learn to worship without an audience, to obey without applause, to create without being celebrated. And it's not easy. You'll wrestle with rejection. You'll question your voice. You'll wonder if your impact even matters. But all the while, God is building something stronger in you than visibility ever could. Authenticity. You're not showing up to be seen anymore. You're showing up because you're sent. And that shift is everything. Because here's what no one tells you. If you don't master your identity in the secret place, the public place will destroy you. If you don't know who you are before they know your name, their opinions will start shaping your value. That's why this unseen season is sacred. It's not God ignoring you, it's God insulating you. He's keeping your soul safe while your roots grow deep, because the deeper the roots, the higher the tree can rise without falling. And slowly you'll begin to see the fruit. Not because the world suddenly pays attention, but because your spirit becomes unshakable. You stop shrinking when overlooked. You stop striving when underappreciated. You walk in rooms without needing to prove yourself. You speak without begging for approval. Because you know the one who sees you in secret is the same one who rewards in due season. And when he opens the door, no man will be able to take credit for what he built in you when no one else was watching. This is what being forged by God looks like. You don't get applause for surviving silent seasons. You don't get headlines for being faithful when no one's clapping. But heaven sees it all. Every unseen yes, every quiet tear, every faithful act. And one day, God will make public what he perfected in private. But even before he does, you'll know who you are. And that, right there, is what makes you unstoppable. So let me ask you, have you been feeling unseen lately? Like your consistency is invisible, your heart is overlooked, your calling is in waiting. If that's been your reality, drop it in the comments right now and write, "God sees me even when no one else does." Or share how he's been speaking to you in this silent season. Your vulnerability might be the exact confirmation someone else is praying for right now. If you've made it this far, it means this message spoke to something deep inside you, and we'd love to know how. Share in the comments below. How did this video touch your heart? What moment resonated with you the most? Your story might be the exact encouragement someone else needs today. And if this content moved you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another word that could realign your soul, renew your purpose, and bring you closer to the voice of God. Hit the like button to support this mission of spreading light, truth, and healing to hearts around the world. And of course, watch the next video that's already on the end screen, because your journey doesn't end here. What's coming next might just be the confirmation you've been